The strategic importance of Okinawa and the island hopping campaign. By the beginning of 1945, the Allied forces had steadily pushed Japanese control back across the Pacific, reclaiming key islands and gaining strategic momentum. The U.S. Marines' capture of Iwo Jima in March marked a particularly grueling and bloody victory, but it demonstrated that the Japanese homeland was now within reach. The Allies' next target was Okinawa, the largest of the Ryukyu Islands, a chain of 161 islands stretching from southern Japan toward Taiwan. This island would become the critical launchpad for a potential invasion of the Japanese home islands, and planners on both sides recognized that the stakes could not be higher. The U.S. strategy of island hopping, gradually capturing islands closer to Japan, had already brought American forces within striking distance of the enemy's core territory, and Okinawa presented both a strategic prize and a formidable challenge. Japanese forces were well aware of Okinawa's importance and had fortified the island extensively. They constructed a naval base, 7 airfields on surrounding smaller islands, and a network of defensive positions designed to exploit the rugged terrain. The northern portion of the island was mountainous, riddled with deep ravines and gullies, while the southern section was somewhat flatter but covered with limestone ridges, caves, and other natural defensive positions. In addition to the challenging landscape, Okinawa was home to roughly 435,000 civilians, primarily concentrated in the south. These locals, culturally distinct from mainland Japanese, spoke the Ryukyuan language and were often viewed with disdain by Japanese garrison forces. To ensure local cooperation, Japanese authorities heavily relied on propaganda, instilling fear of the Americans and promoting unwavering loyalty to the emperor. Continuous U.S. air raids since September 1944 had reinforced these fears, devastating Naha, the island's capital, and its port. As the Allied invasion approached, Okinawa became a stage for a battle that would be seen as a prelude to a potential assault on Japan itself. With both sides carefully observing troop performance for lessons in future campaigns, Japanese defenses and Allied preparations, the defense of Okinawa was commanded by Lieutenant General Matsuru Ushijima, leading the Japanese 32nd Army, which numbered approximately 100,000 troops of varying skill and experience. Veteran units, such as the 62nd and 24th Divisions, brought experience from campaigns in China, though the 24th Division had less combat readiness. Supplementing them were understrength units like the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade, alongside mobilized Air Force personnel, civilian naval staff, and conscripted Okinawans. Civilian involvement extended to 17,000 lightly armed Home Guard units and 2,000 teenagers, some, as young as 14, organized into the so-called Blood and Iron Students' Corps. Although Japanese forces were limited in heavy weaponry, they possessed sufficient artillery and mortar to threaten advancing U.S. troops. By contrast, Allied forces, under Operation Iceberg, were staggering in their scope. Over 100,000 soldiers and 88,000 Marines prepared to storm Okinawa, backed by a fleet of 300 warships and more than 1,100 other vessels. With complete air cover from the Army and Navy, US planners, led by Admiral Raymond A. Stevens, selected a 12.8-kilometer stretch of the western coastline for landings, aiming to secure Kadena and Yontan airfields before advancing inland to divide and isolate Japanese forces. The U.S. strategy relied on overwhelming firepower, expecting up to 85% casualties in the first assault waves. Yet the Japanese anticipated the Allied invasion and formulated a plan that would allow U.S. troops to land unopposed, only to be drawn into attritional battles along the ridges, caves, and fortified positions of southern Okinawa. This tactical choice, though seemingly passive, demonstrated a deep understanding of the island's terrain, and the Japanese goal of maximizing Allied casualties while conserving their own forces for the decisive stages of the campaign. Initial landings and the Japanese strategy of attrition. On April 1, 1945, 2 U.S. Marine divisions and 2 Army divisions landed on Okinawa, facing only sporadic mortars and artillery fire. The Japanese decision not to contest the beachhead initially stunned U.S. troops accustomed to fierce resistance, as Marine Eugene Sledge recalled the relief after landing, noting the contrast with the bloody Peleliu campaign. Only 55 of the 50,000 landing troops were killed or missing during this first assault. This minimal opposition, aligned perfectly with General Ushijima's strategy, allowed the Americans to penetrate the island's central plains before channeling them into deadly engagements along the southern ridges and fortified positions. Japanese forces in the north conducted harassment tactics. While the main defensive effort concentrated around Shuri Castle, the Army headquarters, Colonel Haramichi Yahara, observing the disconnect between frontline realities and Imperial headquarters expectations, expressed skepticism about Tokyo's promises of air support and reinforcements. In the following days, U.S. troops advanced with little resistance, capturing key airfields and splitting the island. However, as they pressed further, Japanese defenders began mounting organized ambushes and hit-and-run attacks, especially in forested regions like the Motobu Peninsula. By April 4, Americans encountered well-entrenched Japanese positions along Kakuza, and Tombstone Ridges, which inflicted severe casualties while simultaneously suffering heavy losses themselves due to close-range artillery and rifle fire. The Japanese, desperate yet determined, resorted to unconventional tactics, including psychological harassment inspired by historical warriors. To maintain pressure on U.S. forces despite diminishing resources and morale, kamikaze attacks and naval engagements while the battle raged on land. Japanese air and naval forces sought to inflict devastating losses on the U.S. fleet supporting the invasion. Beginning April 6, Japanese kamikaze pilots launched relentless suicide attacks against the Fifth Fleet, a tactic honed during prior engagements in the Philippines. Kamikaze missions proved more accurate and destructive than conventional air attacks, though very few Japanese pilots survived these missions. Over 1,800 kamikaze aircraft attacked U.S. ships in Okinawan airfields from April to June, sinking 26 ships, damaging 225 others, and inflicting 9,700 casualties, the largest for the U.S. Navy since Pearl Harbor. In a dramatic naval gamble, the Japanese deployed the battleship Yamato, the largest warship in the world, on a one-way mission to beach itself on Okinawa and support ground defenders with its guns. U.S. intelligence detected Yamato en route, allowing American bombers and torpedo planes to sink the vessel, killing 3,000 crew members before it could engage. These attacks underscored the lengths to which Japanese forces would go to defend Okinawa, demonstrating a commitment to unconventional and suicidal tactics designed to delay U.S. progress and maximize casualties. Despite these measures, American forces pressed forward, confronting both natural and man-made obstacles as they moved toward the island's southern strongholds, aware that each ridge, cave, and fortified position could exact a heavy toll. The battle for Shuri and civilian suffering. By late May, U.S. forces had encountered the most heavily fortified Japanese positions of the campaign, centered on the Shuri defensive line, including Sugarloaf Hill, the Horseshoe, and Conical Hill. Torrential persistent rains had transformed the terrain into a muddy quagmire, stalling vehicles and exhausting infantry. Japanese defenders expertly used reverse slope positions to minimize their exposure while inflicting maximum casualties. In response, American units employed flamethrower tanks, satchel charges, and napalm strikes to clear entrenched enemy positions and extensive cave networks. Following the collapse of the Japanese eastern flank and the U.S. capture of Naha in late May, Japanese troops began a withdrawal further south, striving to maintain unit cohesion and continue their war of attrition. The suffering of Okinawan civilians reached catastrophic levels throughout the battle. While a partial evacuation had been conducted, many civilians remained near military installations. Some were coerced into labor and combat support roles, while others, influenced by Japanese propaganda warning of American brutality, were driven to mass suicide. These civilians endured unimaginable hardships, forced labor, being used as human shields, and witnessing the deaths of family and neighbors. U.S. troops, largely inexperienced in combat zones populated by non-combatants at times, killed civilians suspected of aiding the enemy, adding to the pervasive chaos. Eyewitness accounts from Marines and soldiers describe a grim tableau. Once idyllic valleys turned into horrific landscapes of water-filled shell craters, deep mud, and unburied corpses. These scenes starkly illustrated the profound physical and psychological toll exacted on both the American forces and the island's inhabitants. The final stages and strategic consequences. By early June, Japanese forces had been reduced to approximately 30,000 troops, many of them wounded, concentrated on the Keihan Peninsula for a final stand. Despite repeated American attempts to secure a surrender, the defenders continued their fierce resistance in brutal close-quarters combat. The final days were marked by key successes and setbacks. Notably, Lieutenant General Simon Buckner, commander of the U.S. 10th Army, was killed by enemy fire on June 18, a stark illustration of the campaign's ferocity even as Allied victory became assured. Organized Japanese resistance ended symbolically on June 23, when General Mitsuru Ushijima and his chief of staff, Major General Isamu Keiichi, committed ritual suicide. Ushijima led a final charge from his headquarters before taking his own life. The human cost of the Battle of Okinawa was staggering. American forces suffered roughly 12,500 combat deaths, including 3,000 Marines, 4,600 Army soldiers, and 4,900 sailors. Japanese military casualties were catastrophic, with approximately 66,000 killed. Half of the survivors were wounded. The toll on Okinawan civilians was even more devastating, with an estimated 140,000 dead, nearly one-third of the island's pre-war population. The Japanese defensive strategy, though ultimately a defeat, succeeded in inflicting severe attrition. It drained American resources and morale, offering a sobering preview of the potential cost of a full-scale invasion of the Japanese home islands. U.S. military planners subsequently used what they termed the Okinawa rate of casualties to project losses for Operation Downfall, estimating up to 1 million American casualties. Strategically, the battle's brutality profoundly influenced Allied leadership. The horrific cost of securing Okinawa weighed heavily on President Harry Truman and his advisors as they deliberated on ending the war. The campaign thus stands at a critical intersection where the grim realities of tactical victory and attritional warfare directly informed the momentous strategic decision to use atomic weapons, shaping the final conclusion of World War II in the Pacific.